Okay. Yes, so just a little background about this series. Groups like Maine Climate Action now often do a lot of advocacy in the legislature, but there's also this ecosystem of governmental bodies that are just as important when we talk about environmental justice and implementing a just transition in Maine. But what are they? How do they work? How can we encourage them to take a closer look at climate justice? That's what we're delving into this series. In the first two episodes, we had a great set of presentations and discussions about the energy regulatory landscape in the state, net energy billing, and community solar projects, and how they're all related to each other. Today, in this third episode, we're talking about how to hold utilities accountable and how labor organizing is related to this issue. We're joined by Lucy Hochschartner, the Climate and Clean Energy Director of MCV, Maine Conservation Voters, and Francis Eanes, the Executive Director of Maine Labor Climate Council, or MLCC. Lucy will give a short presentation about legislation she's been leading. Francis Eanes and she will engage in a discussion. We'll open it up for questions from the audience, and you're also welcome to ask questions in the chat at any time. We'll go until 12 or until 1 o'clock, and then we'll also have an additional 15-minute office hours section for anyone who wants to stay a little bit longer and engage with the speakers. Oh, the bios, here we go. So Lucy works at MCV, Maine Conservation Voters, to help the state meet our climate and clean energy goals in a way that improves the lives of all Mainers. Her focus areas include expanding offshore wind and solar energy in Maine, enhancing energy justice overall. In previous years, she's worked in youth climate organizing, electoral campaigns, and other utility accountability efforts, including as the deputy campaign manager of the Pine Tree Power Campaign. Francis Eanes is the executive director of Maine Labor Climate Council, coalition of labor unions working to tackle the climate crisis at the speed and scale it requires, while simultaneously ensuring that climate solutions lift up working people and their communities. He builds coalitions within the labor movement and with allied climate and environmental organizations to advance ambitious clean energy policy and workforce development. Previous years, he taught at the Environmental Studies program at Bates College, where he also did higher education labor organizing. So I'm really excited to have these speakers here today, and I will pass it over to Lucy.
Amazing. Thanks, Ezra. Hi, everyone. Like Ezra said, my name is Lucy Hochschartner. I think I've probably met some of you before. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at MCV, and just going to start off with a quick presentation and happy to answer questions at any point. Feel free to jump in. I won't be able to see you though, so feel free to interrupt me. So really, when I think about utility accountability, I'm thinking about how we get the grid we deserve. Like, it doesn't make sense to just try and hold the utility accountable for the sake of holding it accountable. There are a lot of things utilities are responsible for doing. There's a lot of different kinds of utilities. And really, we want to make sure that it works better for real people, whether that's to make more clean electricity, whether to get more reliable power, cheaper power. There are a lot of different goals, and everyone is probably coming to the table with a different reason for being interested in this. I originally came to the table being interested in how do we make the grid cleaner. I first got introduced to utility issues when I was living in Montana, which is a huge fossil fuel producing state. So the grid was incredibly reliant on coal and gas. Since moving to Maine, I've done a lot of work also on affordability issues because Maine has some of the highest electricity prices in the country. And the way to get them cheaper is by making sure we hold the utility accountable, making sure we get more clean electricity onto the grid, and making sure that we are doing our rates in the most equitable way possible. But I think before jumping into really specifically how do we hold the utility accountable, it's really important to know what our energy system looks like. This might be a review for some folks, but even I come back to this a lot when I'm thinking about testifying on bills, like what part of the energy system are we looking at today? Where are the intervention points that we have? So our energy system looks something like this. On the far left, we have the generation side of things. That's the power plants, wind turbines, solar, like utility scale solar, We have hydro, we have natural gas, we have a lot of natural gas. And in Maine, we have what's called a deregulated utility system. And so this generation side of things is a market. It's a regional market run by ISO New England. And basically, the thing to know is that it's not actually owned by our utility companies, so it's separate. We then have the big transmission lines that take power across the region. This is also really done at the regional level for the most part. Then we have the distribution lines. That's, what you see outside your house. That is largely controlled by CMP and Versant, depending on where you live. We do have some small consumer-owned utilities in Maine. Then some people have solar on their rooftops or solar in their houses. It's a little different than that utility scale in that it's on the other side of the meter. So it's, closer to your house and you have some sort of relationship with the utility for how to either have a battery to connect it to your home, or you've connected it into the grid. Then you have your house where we actually use the power. And even in your house nowadays, we sometimes consider this part of the energy system because there are various sorts of demand response programs, which are technologies that allow you to shift around when you're using power. And that's a really critical part of the energy transition, making sure that we are shifting around when we use power to match it when we have power with all of the renewable technologies that we're using that are a little bit more variable than our traditional fossil fuel sources. So that's what the grid looks like. It's largely divided into generation on one side and delivery, which can be separated into transmission and distribution on the other. And then in terms of the players, in terms of who regulates this system, where we can go to for various kinds of accountability measures. The big one that you've probably heard of is the Public Utilities Commission. This is in Augusta. I go there sometimes. It's really not a scary or imposing building. You can show up. I really like it because they have their own parking lot, so it's not hard to get there. They have 3 appointed commissioners who are confirmed by the state legislature. They have a bunch of staff who do a lot of critical work. And I think the big thing to know about the Public Utilities Commission is that it's responsible for finding the right balance between the utility and the public interest. So this is sometimes news to people that the Public Utilities Commission is not actually responsible for fighting for you as a customer. They are more similar to a judge in a courtroom. Like if we were going to pick an analogy here, they are trying to find the right balance between the big utility company on one side and the public on the other. We have the Office of the Public Advocate, who is also in Augusta. They have 1 appointed and confirmed advocate and a bunch of staff. And they are much more similar to a public defender. So they show up at the PUC in varieties of hearings and proceedings to fight for you as the customer. So if you need information or want to learn more about rates, often the OPA is where I go. And the PUC is much more the decision maker, and the OPA is more like your lawyer. So in terms of what that system has given us today, like why do we need utility accountability? We have a really high energy burden in Maine, which is a huge affordability issue. So energy burden is the amount that you pay on electricity or other household energy costs as compared to your income. And in Maine, that is very, very high. It's some of the highest in the country because we don't have very high incomes and we have very high energy costs due to fossil fuels. So that has resulted in Maine electric utilities sending over 400,000 disconnection notices to Maine families in 2023, while they made over $200 million in profit. So it's not a very fair system. Low-income Mainers are spending 14% of their income on household energy costs. 8% of that is to electric. The other is to, gas or heating oil, depending on how they heat their homes. But across the board, it's roughly twice what is considered affordable. And that has meant that more than 100,000 Maine families could qualify for low-income assistance programs. These are people who struggle to pay their electric bills. So it's a huge issue in Maine. It affects a lot of people, and it affects those people pretty severely, like more than They're paying more than double what would be considered an affordable cost for them. We have a bunch of different routes to how we can think about making this system more fair, holding the utilities accountable for creating a better system, because there are a bunch of different entry points to that grid that we talked about at the beginning. We can change laws at the legislature. That's a route that my organization goes a lot. We are at the legislature a bunch. We have lobbyists, we write legislation, we work with legislators, we work on campaigns. We can also intervene at rate cases at the PUC. So those are kind of like those court hearings, essentially, where they decide the rates that electric customers will pay. This is not something that MCV has traditionally done, but there are many other organizations in Maine that will intervene in these rate cases. And sometimes this can be a route to both getting lower costs, but even to getting other things. So it's possible to intervene in rate cases, and often they end up in a settlement, just like a court case might. And so you can settle with the utility to get other things like better reliability or meet other goals. You can file comments in dockets the PUC, so they have these proceedings, sort of like the legislature has hearings, and you can submit comments. Those sometimes involve changing the rules at the PUC. So some things are in statute set by the legislature, some of the rules. And then often the PUC goes in and has to make more specific technical rules than the legislature has. Because they have more expertise. And so sometimes you can change the policies just right at the PUC without actually having to change the law itself in the legislature. And then there's obviously actions outside of the system. My first foray into electricity was protesting our electric utility in Montana. And so it was all sort of outside of the system, and we would meet with the CEO, and we sort of went direct to the utility for our advocacy. But here we have a really exciting piece of utility accountability legislation, so changing the law, that first way to go about accountability, that is going to get introduced this year. It hasn't yet been printed, but the title is out, and it's called the Energy Fairness Act. And it's really about doing 4 things. It's about improving fairness for utility customers. So that is getting things like better reporting of what the problem actually is right now. So we don't have a lot of data on how much debt customers have, how often they're disconnected, how long they're disconnected for. We want to get all that data so that we can come up with better solutions. We want to set higher standards for the utilities around their affordability and fairness metrics, and make sure that they're meeting the highest level of what we would consider a good utility. We want to expand the disconnection ban. So in Maine, we have a really great program where we prevent people from getting disconnected from their utility during the winter, because it's so critical to have electricity during the cold months. People should always have electricity, but there are certain populations, vulnerable populations, that are uniquely vulnerable to electricity disconnection because they rely on a medical device, because they're older, because they're an infant. We want to make sure that those groups of people are protected at all times from disconnections. From an accountability perspective, we want to limit what the utility is allowed to get customers to pay for. So the way that it works is the utility spends all this money, and then it goes to the rate case and says, these are the costs that we're passing on to customers. And largely the things that they're allowed to pass on are like their operating costs, the costs of doing business, and they're not allowed to pass on things like their lobbying costs. That's paid for by the shareholders. We want to expand what can't be recovered in rates. So for an example, right now, the utility is allowed to show up at the PUC with a bunch of huge team of lawyers arguing to raise your rates. And then they're allowed to charge you for those same lawyers who argued to raise your rates. So we want to prevent that. We want to improve the transparency and reporting around some of the costs on people's bills and on developers' bills. So one of a big problem has been that when connecting renewables to the grid, there have been large charges from the utilities that we want to get more clarity around. And we also want to protect people from predatory advertising. That's largely not happening from the utility side. That's happening from the competitive electricity providers, which are on the generation side of things. We also are going to have improved labor standards. That's really important because making sure that people have the money to pay their electric bill means we need to make sure people have jobs that are going to pay them enough to pay their electric bill. And making sure that we have a safe and reliable electric system is really reliant on making sure that we have people who know how to do that work. And to do that, we need to make sure that we're paying them well, that we have good apprenticeship programs so that people can learn on the jobs. We want to also provide a definition for environmental justice. We're obviously seeing huge rollbacks of environmental justice programs nationally, and it's more important than ever that we back those up at the state level. And finally, we want to make solar more accessible to low-income customers. So right now, there are just a variety of administrative hurdles for low-income customers to be able to access solar in Maine, which is one of the cheapest ways to get electricity. So this bill is really taken on the whole about making every aspect of that system that we talked about more fair for customers and making sure that the cost of the transition is falling on shareholders, executives, fossil fuel companies, and not on you and me here in Maine who are trying to pay our bills. And then I think it's also worth talking about just a few things that we can even do beyond accountability. There are ways to exit this utility system altogether, and there are some bills around those things at the legislature as well. So distributed generation is one of those. That's the solar on your house that I was talking about. So rather than the utility having a big power plant, having all these little power plants owned by people in their own communities, that's distributed generation. That's a way to sort of get yourself out of that system altogether. There's publicly owned generation. So rather than having power plants owned by big developers. Again, in Maine, they're not owned by the utility because we have that separate system. But rather than being owned by big developers, there's a bill this year in the state legislature to have the Green Bank in Maine invest in a pilot project where they would own, the state would own that generation or invest in that generation, even if they didn't own it outright. They'd put up some money. And then finally, there is also some talk about making new power lines publicly owned to make them cheaper. So basically, these all work by getting that profit out of the equation. These are really different from Pine Tree Power in that they're not about the parts of the system that already exist, but they're saying in new either generation or delivery, what if we just cut the profit and the shareholders out and did it ourselves? So those are just a few bills that kind of take that step beyond accountability and move us into a whole different kind of system. And that's what I've got for you. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, and a lot of people thinking about the best ways to make sure our electric system is just and clean and fair for everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy, and it's great to be with you all. As Ezra said, my name is Francis Eanes, and I am the executive director of Maine Labor Climate Council. We're a coalition of labor unions here in the state of Maine, and our whole reason for being is to help the labor movement, which is comprised of hundreds of unions here in Maine and many, many more across the country, really develop its vision and plan of action on all things climate and clean energy, and to make sure that also at the same time that we are putting working people and working families and our working family institutions, our unions, really in the driver's seat of how we think about climate and clean energy solutions. We want to make sure that this energy transition is built with good union jobs all the way down. What that looks like is very challenging and very different depending on what sector we're talking about. And I want to talk a little bit today, building on some of the really great foundational work that Lucy laid out about utilities and utility worker unions and like what are some ways forward and opportunities here. But before I do, I want to just give kind of like a take a step back and just to make foreground, I think the necessity of this work and the importance of thinking about workers and worker institutions like unions. Um, just consider the fact that, 125 years ago, at the, dawn of the 20th century, like there was very, very little union density in the vast majority of what we today would consider fossil fuel sectors. I mean, the country was powered by coal, eventually became powered by oil, but like before oil, there was coal, right? And coal was there because it was heating people's homes. It was producing the energy needed to make steel, which was like the backbone, and still many ways is, of a lot of the infrastructure that we think about or maybe don't think about in our country. Like fossil fuels are obviously deeply, deeply, deeply embedded into every facet of our economy. But if we go back 125 years, like most of those jobs were low wage jobs. They were brutally, brutally challenging and difficult and unsafe. They were absolutely the places that had racialized and other components that made it um, incredibly brutal working conditions. And so folks, I mean, whether it was like the Irish, the Polish, like building interracial alliances in the South, like there was incredibly difficult, heroic work to organize what we today would think of as the fossil fuel economy. And whether it was the steel workers organizing steel in Pittsburgh, or whether it was the auto workers in Detroit, right, with the sit-down strike in the 1930s, or near where I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania. I mean, like workers literally lost their lives fighting coal barons and coal bosses, just to have like a shred of dignity on the job and to make what would, today be sub living wage, right? This was like, some of the most pitched battles in our country, like aside from the Civil War, were labor battles where workers would come together, like literally with guns to battle bosses who would hire, you know, military folks to come in and put down a strike. We don't think of that today when we think about labor struggles. We tend to think of like the very important, exciting work to organize Starbucks or Amazon. But like the history of labor organizing comes deeply actually out of trying to organize the fossil fuel sector. And as a result of that heroic work, and then the ensuing work to really organize the utilities as we start to build out and electrify rural America in the 1930s under the New Deal, we now have like the vast majority of private sector union density is in fossil fuel or fossil fuel adjacent industries. And so, like, part of what motivates our work as an organization and our sister organizations in 13 other states now is trying to really think hard about what does a just transition actually look like. If you're a union and your family, as a worker, your legacy goes back, generations to having a good job that is tied to fossil fuels, like it is actually quite like rational, insane to look at clean energy with skepticism. And I say that only because like here in the state of Maine, as just one example, and we're not unique, the vast majority of the solar that got built from 2019 to 23, the early years of Maine changing its solar policy, which I think is great, and there's like lots to celebrate there, um, was not built under what working conditions we would consider as like fair or just. It was like a third party developer comes in, often from out of state, is best equipped to handle the regulatory and permitting process, will sub out to again, often out of state contractor who subs out other work to a subcontractor who goes, right? This is like a labor model that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. Not every company in Maine who's building solar or wind or hydro is doing this, to be clear. There are a lot of really good actors, but there's nothing about a clean energy job that makes it a good job. Like we have to fight for that. And if we don't build in strong labor standards on the front end, like I think workers rationally who see themselves and come out of this tradition of like militant union organizing for generations are going to be skeptical and remain skeptical and will often be on the other side of the equation at Standing Rock or Keystone XL. And I think those fights are going to be hard. Like we're going to have those fights about what gets shut down and when we don't build things. But until we can have a real conversation and make concrete progress on showing that this clean energy economy can be built with as good jobs that give you a pension, that give you health care, that follow you, whether you're laid off or working, um, the bar is high. And I think we have a lot, we've made a lot of progress. We have a lot more progress to go. So I share that all as background to say I think there's a similar version of that that plays out here when it comes to utilities and utility workers. And I think this is one of the most challenging conversations out there. And I give Lucy and her colleagues a tremendous amount of credit for really trying to think this through and like do it in a way that is like not at all trying to pit workers against ratepayers, because workers are also ratepayers, right? And really trying to think through where and how accountability can happen in practice. But I want to just leave a couple of observations before we open this up for discussion. Which is that, our utilities in Maine, and like this is true actually across the country, are like highly unionized industries. And I think there's a real opportunity to think about how to chart a different path than the one that we sometimes see, which is when accountability measures that Lucy's described get brought forward. They're coming from a really good place. They're really critical, and there's a lot of good public policy and political sense behind them. But where and how labor gets brought into the conversation, specifically with respect to utility workers and utility worker unions, is really important. And I think there's this key question of like, will workers and their unions side with management or side with something else? And I think every fight is different, and I don't have a perfect set or consistent set of prescriptions here, but do want to offer up a couple of observations, which is at the end of the day, a utility workers union is going to sit down and bargain a contract with management every 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on what they choose. And they are in some ways like wedded to the viability of that company. And like that is a really challenging set of constraints to work in, but also an opportunity. And I want to just lift up a couple of places of how this can play, right? On the one hand, I think there's an obvious path here, which is to say when utility accountability measures get brought, a worker or a workers union can see that as a direct threat to the potential profit that they themselves can bargain over, right? And management will play them every day this way, where they say, hey, well, you know what? We have to give more to ratepayers, or we can't disconnect folks here. Our profits are going to shrink. Therefore, we're going to have to turn the dial back on the raises that we thought we could promise you. And they do that all the time. It's a like tried and true, pretty banal, but like very effective management tactic that's out there. And so I think it's really important to like understand that dynamic and also use that not as the end of the conversation, but as the beginning to actually open up the space to think about, okay, well, what other chips could be put into play. I want to offer just a couple of ideas here. We work and are building a better relationship with one of the utility workers unions here in the state. But I think it's been really interesting and apparent to me as we've gotten to know them better, and as they have shared with us some of the core issues that they have bargained over in the past or are attempting to bargain and make progress on. There's a whole lot that they know about the inner workings of that company and what would improve things, not just for them as workers, but for like all ratepayers themselves. Let me give you one example. Some of you who have maybe had an issue on your bill or with delivery of electricity have on occasion called up, CMP or Versant or whoever it is, right? And like you get routed to a call center. Like that is a IBW 1837 union employee who is employed by the company to answer and handle your call. These folks are under a tremendous amount of strain. Like as unpopular as some of our utilities are for reasons that have nothing to do with their workforce per se, it's not their decision making. They get unloaded on all the time. It's like one of the most stressful, like incredibly emotionally exhausting occupations out there. And, they have to calmly and competently like take in, metabolize, walk through, talk down customers who are deeply frustrated for reasons that, again, that worker, whoever's taking the call, it's not their fault, right? But that's their job, is to absorb all of that incoming, and have to do it professionally and in like a timely manner. And as soon as that call ends, they've got like less than 30 seconds until the next call is coming in, and they're doing this hour, an hour, an hour, back to back to back. And I think there's like they have some really good ideas about how they could increase the staffing in their call center to like allow for like a 1 minute break in between calls so that folks could be like better prepared to take the next call. Um, the company is, at times there's been questions about staffing and short staffing and attrition, and it creates this challenge, right, where folks have to actually go out and um, think, can I do this for a whole career? And I think, there's opportunities like that. If you sit down and talk to workers, talk to their unions to like understand what are the issues are that they want to make progress on, I think it's a real opportunity for allies who care a lot about utility accountability to find common ground in ways that don't get us into this zero sum, deadlock between holding companies accountable and therefore squeezing workers. And I'm happy to offer other things out there, but at the end of the day, these folks actually build and maintain the grid, and I think have a lot of ideas about what could be improved to make it easier for a distributed generation to come online, for interconnection queues to be shortened, for like rational behind the meter solutions to integrate well with what's in front of the meter. And I think like those worker voices and that worker knowledge is like a fundamentally critical and essential piece of how we're going to decarbonize at the pace and scale that we need to. And I think is also like the way in to finding some like outside the box solutions that make that decarbonization work happen in ways that, yes, bring down cost to ratepayers, but also do it in ways that don't come on the backs of a really important workforce. So I want to just, leave you with those solutions there. And one more observation, which is that I think there's a tendency among some in the utility accountability um, world, and certainly in the clean energy and climate and enviro world. And I will not name names or point fingers at all. I have deep respect and admiration for so many. To look at, I think, the very real challenges with the investor-owned utility model and become skeptical of utility scale solutions. And I want to offer up just like a couple of pieces here that I think are really important to hang on to maybe disentangle and put some more nuanced spin on this, which is that like utility scale solutions, I think, are actually really important, and actually are not necessarily in conflict with distributed generation or virtual power plants, but I think matter a lot for how we're going to build things at the pace and scale that we need and build them in ways that are interoperable with existing technologies and do it in ways that actually take seriously and attend to these questions of equity. And just to pick up on one really concrete piece here, as people defect from the grid and create their own sources of power, like there is a real question about like who picks up that stranded cost of existing infrastructure. And as the customer base potentially shrinks over time, whether this is for gas or for electricity or other forms of utilities, there's a real question about like who is left paying the costs of this fixed infrastructure. And so there's a really, in my view, important role to play here for like a managed approach that is actually trying to think about how do we do neighborhood scale decarbonization, right? In front of the meter, behind the meter, like whatever it is, virtual power plants. How do we convert everyone to heat pumps in a whole neighborhood and do it in a way that thinks about demand and load management in rational ways? That has to be done with utilities. And I think there's a deeper question here around ownership and profit. I think that's really important, but that needs to be in some ways like disentangled from this question of utility scale planned and managed solutions that I want to just make sure folks don't lose sight of. I think the other good case for like utility scale solutions here is that the question of how we can finance things by having spreading out costs over time over a rate base is actually potentially a useful tool, even if the way that we do it now is not as fair as it could be. But the principle of making sure that people don't face a really high upfront cost is actually a really good one. And we should just think through what are other revenue sources that we can use? What are other ways to do cost recovery that can ensure that we don't have regressive mechanisms that put high costs on ratepayers? Just to be totally blunt here, if you don't have $2,000, even if there's a generous subsidy from our state for a heat pump, like you're not going to put that in. That's the bottom line, right? And so we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater here as we think about this question of scale. And the last thing I'll say is, from a labor standards standpoint, whether we're talking about utility workers or other construction workers who are doing installations or retrofits or weatherization, I think there's a really important piece here, which is residential scale work with little mom and pop companies tends to be where we see the most challenge from a job quality standpoint. It is really hard to enforce good labor standards, whether it's wages, benefits, working conditions, when we have 2,000 contractors that all employ one person, as opposed to a smaller number that, like, yes, maybe they're larger and folks don't like big, but like there's at least an opportunity to hold folks accountable and ensure we have a higher wage floor or a standard of work. And I think as we think about utility scale solutions, again, I'm thinking agnostically or about who owns it. There's a real opportunity here to make sure that we have, fewer bids that can really like ensure good quality work, ensure a good quality workforce, do like rational workforce development, and ensure we have good standards for whoever's doing the work. So I want to leave you with that. I'm happy to pivot over to our broader conversation, but just want to emphasize I like have great admiration for the awesome work that Lucy and others are doing on this bill. Like, we're part of it, we're excited to be part of it, and we want to continue helping to push, within the labor movement to find win-win solutions that are moving at the pace and scale we need on climate, lowering costs for ratepayers, and lifting up good quality union jobs for all workers as we go through this process.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate that overview, Francis. Let's get into some of the questions. Okay, first one is for Lucy. Oh, you can see it. Why don't we have good data on reporting of user debt and disconnection?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one that, so I think worth noting. I mentioned that I used to work on these issues in Montana. I moved to Montana to be a professional biathlete, which is like cross country skiing and target shooting. But I had worked on campaigns before, and Montana is one of the few states that elects their public service commission. And I had kind of a like crotchety professor in college who was like, all the youth are talking about the Green New Deal and no one's showing up to the Public Service Commission. And I needed a job and like had that in my head. And I was like, oh, maybe I should work for a candidate for Public Service Commission. That's how I got into utility issues. I am not like classically trained in any of these things. So in finding a lot of this, like I've just been going through and reading the PUC rules myself. So it was also a surprise to me, like why don't we have this? I've been searching for the reasons this year as we work on this bill. Right now, from what I can tell, and all of these rules are in I'm happy to send the chapters to anyone who wants, but basically the utilities have certain things that they have to report to the PUC each year. Some of that includes disconnection data, but the improved standards that we would be looking at would be getting that data at a more granular level. So some states get that data at a zip code level so that you can see where the problem really is and target your solutions. The other thing is that it's being reported to the PUC, but it's not like in a public docket, from what I can tell. And if it's not in a public docket, it makes it harder for the advocates or for customers to be able to see that. So we really want to make sure that it's readily available. And so I think in terms of the reason, I don't think it was nefarious. It's just like the way a lot of things in energy, it happens that like the legislature will pass a law, the PUC will turn it into a rule, and then over time you sort of just realize and say, hey, that's not necessarily working the way I thought it was going to work. So it evolves over time, and we just have ended up with this situation where it's really hard to know how many disconnections are happening, what people's experience is with them in terms of how long they go on, how many people end up getting reconnected. And then the debt is a big one that I want to see better data on, is like how many customers are in debt, how much debt do they have, how long does it take them to pay it back.
Okay, we have one more previous question, then I'll pass it over to Halsey, but this is kind of the whole game, which is how do we follow along with your legislation and support it when the time comes?
A fantastic question. There are so many ways to get involved. So I'll start off by saying that right now the title has been put in, we have a sponsor, but it hasn't been printed. So if you look for it, there's not going to be anything you can do right now. But I can put a petition in the chat that you can sign. By signing that petition, you will be saying, I support energy fairness. I want the legislature and Governor Mills to act. We'll follow up with all the people who sign this petition and let you know when the bill gets printed. We'll ask you if you'd be willing to testify. There is also going to be the opportunity to come to events. We are having events around the state as MCV, helping people understand their utility bill. So we're going to go look at utility bills together, look at what each of the charges are, where it comes from, how we can lower parts of the bill, and getting the word out about this. So if you are someone who has a group of people, like you have friends who meet for coffee, or you are a part of a church group that has a coffee hour, or you are a local activist and you want to host us, we have the curriculum already. It's about an hour and a half presentation, and we'd love to come. So if you have a space or a group that regularly meets, that's another great way that you can help us push this over the finish line. And when the time comes that it's printed, we'll also reach out to folks for LTEs and things like that. And you can also always send the petition along to a few friends.
All right, thanks so much, Lucy. And we'll send out both your emails. Is that okay? So that people can get in contact with you? Okay, great.
Of course.
Okay. Next is Halsey.
Thank you, Ezra. This is for Lucy. And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but there are politics even within the environmental movement here in Maine. And I'm just curious, given the slide you had about exiting the investor-owned utility system completely, which is the raison d'etre, is it not, for the Our Power group and movement, which I know you were involved with. And so I'm just wondering, do you have any awareness of where they stand in relation to this, what you've been presenting today? And wouldn't they seem to be a natural ally? Or I don't know what's up with them. So that's why I'm asking if you happen to know.
That's a fantastic question. So yes, a few things. MCV stayed neutral on Pine Tree Power. As I mentioned, worked on it. MCV wasn't against it, just sort of stayed totally neutral, not involved. MCV, on the other hand, is very interested in the benefits of public power for new generation or new lines. So that was sort of that beyond accountability section. There are a number of things moving in the legislature and on that longer term end of things, like we need immediate solutions and we need to create a better grid. And those are all things that a number of people on these calls are working on. In terms of Our Power, it mostly was it was much larger last year. Like it had far more staff when it was a campaign than when I was working for it. They do still exist. They are working on a number of measures. We're in conversation. I think these are all things like, I don't want to speak for them and that they haven't, like anyone, seen the bill because it hasn't been printed yet. But I think these are all things that they would support. And yes, there's still, I think everyone has an awareness that the Pine Tree Power loss was pretty complete. And so even if you are an Our Power that is looking to make the system public in the long term, it's probably not like the immediate next thing you can do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Next is Kelsey. We need to get some questions for Francis in here too. I feel bad.
I know, I apologize. My question is also for Lucy, but thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today. There's been some great information that you folks have given out. I work with the Wabanaki nations in the state of Maine, and in preparation for future development, specifically solar generation on some tribal facilities, we have funding for upgrades to our existing infrastructure. And I'm wondering if there is an official request or pathway that I should follow to request that our local utility company matches the amount of funds that we could put in for these upgrades. I don't know if that is something that has been done before, or you have any information that you'd recommend on that.
That's a fantastic question. And my first, because I don't want to lead anyone astray, I don't know of this having happened before. And so I don't have like a program I can point you to. But I have, you know, I worked on the Pine Tree Power campaign. I'm not the utility's favorite person. And I have found everyone who works there to be like, just call them up.
Okay.
I think it's really always worth the call. And if you don't feel like you're connecting with the right person at the utility, I always find the Office of the Public Advocate to be super easy to navigate and incredibly helpful. And then the PUC, like I said, is a little bit more of an arbiter, but they do have a consumer protection division that focuses a little bit more on customers as well. But I would call the utility in that case, and it's not something that they usually do, but I do think it is the kind of thing that maybe in this specific circumstance would be worth discussing. Generally, like the cost of the upgrades for new developments fall on the developer, but I think always worth an ask. And then go to other nonprofits as well that are trying to expand the build out of clean energy, and sometimes they are able, most in Maine that I know of don't have like money for this, but they sometimes know of funders who would fund like direct to you all.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Just to add one small nuance here too, I think it depends on whether you're talking about grid upgrades or generation capacity. If it's generation capacity, there's going to be like a separation of church and state here about whether a transmission and distribution utility, is prohibited from owning generation or investing in generation. But I think there's other ways to think about how to do that.
Right.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I'm going to put in a plug for another bill here, which is actually coming up next week in the Energy Committee, and that is sponsored by Representative Sophie Warren, and that is to be more fair, for Efficiency Maine to be more fair in their goals. Right now, a lot of the funding is going to mid and high income earners. I think that's primarily because it's easy to do. And what Warren's bill proposes, LD 946, is that Efficiency Maine funds half of their money fund moderate and low income households. Right now, their goals fall far short of that 50%, at least that 50%. It should be more, but at least Warren's bill gets us up into the 55%. I'll give you an example of one of their goals right now, to weatherize 3,300 homes per year, total homes per year. Only 500 of those homes would be low income and 600 would be moderate income. So that's far short, probably half as much as what the population would represent. So LD 946 public hearing is on the 26th of next week. I believe it's at 10 o'clock for the Energy Committee. If people can send the committee an email, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that directly relates to what Francis was saying about if you don't have the upfront money, then it doesn't matter how big of a rebate you're getting. So that's great.
And I'll just build on, if I can, real quick. We're actually working with Representative Warren on this bill, and there'll be some additions to it that are also saying, in addition to everything Bill described, which is going to remain, there'll be some sections that talk about how to have Efficiency Maine braid their funding with Maine Housing, which gets federal funding specifically for low-income weatherization. And right now, these programs don't interact with each other, and there's money that's sitting on the table on the sideline, unable to be spent because of how federal rules are set up. And so the idea is to really actually leverage and double the pace of weatherization, especially for low and moderate income. So all the more reason to come and support.
Thank you. Yeah, and just a reminder, we will send out all these resources in a follow-up email and add them to our running resource document, so everyone will be able to access them. I'm curious, so Francis, you talked about how utilities or utility workers and utility reform advocates often are coming at this from different perspectives, but you have been able to successfully collaborate to an extent in this legislation. Can you maybe begin, and Lucy, talk about the process of creating a coalition around this legislation? Who are the different stakeholders that you wanted to engage with, and what are kind of the conversations and push and pull and compromises that you've made along the way?
I'll maybe just take a quick stab at this, and Lucy jump in. I think, for the sake of like what will be obvious here in a moment, like won't share specifics around this one, but I think there's some broader principles at work that might be helpful to share, which is like, I think for many of the reasons that I talked about, there's a lot of mistrust among parts of the labor movement to working in coalition with whether it's utility accountability advocates, whether it is ratepayer advocates, whether it is clean energy advocates more generally. And I think some of that mistrust is earned, some of it maybe is unfair, some of it is just from misunderstanding. But I think like, look, if you think of some of the signal fights of the last 10 years, it's like Dakota Access, it's Standing Rock, is things that have like pitted parts of the labor movement who depend on building things against folks who say they do not want to see something built. And like those are really, really, really challenging, like zero-sum affairs when those conflicts come up. And I'm not here to adjudicate them. I think there's like really understandable reasons for like, and all kinds of, tribal sovereignty, all kinds of things that are attached to it. And I'm not pretending to say that there's like the worker issue should dominate. I am simply saying, I think the effect of those fights has been to create, in some ways, I think, mistrust, and has made it challenging to really build the kinds of coalitions that I think we urgently need to build. And I know that Lucy and others are like deeply committed to building. So like, what can you do alternative to that? I think it's like, it's start small. Like, don't try and like have a grand bargain that solves the whole thing right out of the gate, because I don't think we have enough trust there to do that. I think it's like finding really concrete things that have low enough stakes that should they not succeed, like everyone can still go home and like we're all going to be okay. And like ideally we make progress, right, on like one issue that builds trust and builds like, the kinds of personal relationships that are necessary to really like take risks institutionally, right? And then you come back and do it again. And you like, I'm not saying you have to always go slow, but I think like there needs to be some kind of thing out of the gate that like shows proof of concept, and that like coalitions can get the goods in ways that are additive and not zero sum to really go bigger. I think the other thing, and this again maybe sounds really basic, but like is often challenging. Campaigns happen at timings that are not necessarily conducive to like trust building. They happen because there's, an election every 2 years, or because this crisis happens and we have to respond. And I think that's all understandable, but it also, I think, short circuits what really needs to happen, which is a foundation for trust building is like actually deeply understanding like where good faith actors are coming from on the other side. I'm not here saying like, oh, if we just sat and talk to XYZ company, like they'd agree with us. We'd go on. No, I'm talking about like folks who genuinely are committed to finding a pathway forward. Like when you sit down and talk to any union, like that as part of our coalition or that we're trying to bring into our coalition, 90% of it, the conversation is just like me listening and trying to understand like what are the day-to-day realities that they work with, what are their core goals, how do they see like the broader landscape that we're all operating in, what are the opportunities and threats, and like it's from that picture of listening and understanding that there's, I think, the germs and like the genesis of a possible like, hey, let's try and work on this one issue together with these other advocates that normally you're on the other side of the fence with. And that's I don't know of another way to do it. I guess I'm super open to it, but Lucy, I'm curious if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would echo so much of what Francis is saying. And I think similarly, like, um, Francis has been so great to work with. And like, I think it's about, um, both getting trust and relationships on the labor side and the environmental side and the consumer protection side and the customer side. Because right now I'm a representative of an environmental group. Francis is a representative kind of the labor side of things. There's also a lot of mistrust of both of those sides from like customer protection groups for, again, good reasons. Um, and so it's a matter of building trust among all of those sides and also just among the literal people in the room. And like Francis and I have a lot of trust, and Francis and I will just call each other up and be like, so what are we doing here? And that's really helpful. And having those relationships is really helpful. I think what I also think about a lot in this work, and this is something like I'm not that old, but I feel like I'm now like in several years of doing this and have really come a long way on this. Marshall Gans is like a famous organizer, and he always says, "Don't start with what your issue is, but who are your people." And I definitely, like, when I was right out of college, started with like my issue was climate. The thing I care about, like that I spend my life doing is climate. But I think more and more I think about, well, the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we have the political power to win the things we want to win. Like climate is not a technological problem anymore. We have all of the solutions we need. It is a political problem, and we need the people. And so who are those people going to be? Um, and when you start thinking about who are your people going to be, and thinking about the broader power structures underneath it all, it's super natural for environmental groups and labor unions to align, because we're actually both trying to work against this like huge CEO who's making a lot of money. Like the only reason we get stuck in this scarcity environment of like, well, is it going to be the environmental standards or the workers' salaries, is if you assume that there's going to be some executive making like $10 million off the top. If you get rid of that and can work together against that, then there's actually more for both of you. And I think the same thing goes for ratepayers. So when I'm thinking about like, who are our people, workers, working people, customers, people who care about having clean water, clean air, a healthy climate, like those are all the same people. And we've kind of set up these almost arbitrary divides. Like workers are also people who pay utility bills, who are also people who care about having a place for their kids to grow up. And all of those people are different from the fossil fuel companies, the executives, the multinational corporations that like don't have to worry about any of those things because they're making so much money. And so I think sometimes it helps to just take that step back and start from like, who are we really trying to organize with, rather than the specific issue, and figure out how to work back from there and say like, where is that issue that we could first align?
Thank you so much. I think you've pre-answered a question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it might relate a little bit more to just people as individuals rather as representatives of larger organizations. So it is, what's the most effective role the public can play in facilitating work upgrades in the energy transition economy? Are there particular groups that would be important to join, and noted that the need to avoid these like Lucy's saying, these false divisions between ratepayers and workers seems challenging. So how do I, as a member of the public watching this call that isn't necessarily the representative organization, start doing this work that you've been modeling?
That's a fantastic question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I still don't feel like I'm doing enough. Like, man, right? If we go out and look at the world, things are are bad right now. And I think it's so important to just start from where you're at, and organizing always happens with relationships. That is the only way political power is built. So like you can go out and tell one person about this bill. Maybe it's your spouse, it's your kid, it's your family member. I think it's important to tell one person who you think is going to be really excited about it, and then to have a conversation with one person who maybe you need to like work a little harder to bring into the fold. And then it helps to find a place to do that organizing work. And so MCV does a lot of it, MLCC does a lot of it. There are many groups working on this bill. MCAN does a lot of it. And it's just a matter of figuring out, we're all doing the same work, and it's just like which flavor fits you best, and where are you going to feel most politically at home. And for some people, it's like electoral politics, and for some people, it's an advocacy organization. For some people, it's a protest group. But wherever is going to keep you coming back is like the right place to be.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and we should have a whole separate conversation on this. I think there's a macro level challenge that I see, which is like, we are facing massive geographic and educational polarization within the one party that is supposedly like in favor of workers' rights and clean energy and all of that. And like that is like an existential question of like, how do we actually transform the political culture that I think is one of the biggest barriers to making good progress here. I think that is going to require, I think, folks who are on this call and like, broadly identify with this movement to really think about how to build a deeper working class analysis. And like, our communities are literally divided around like, whether you shower in the morning or at night, right? Based on the kind of work you have. So that's just like a reality we need to confront. I think there's some practical thoughts I have, which is like organize your workplace. Join a union if you're not part of one. If that's not a reality that makes sense to you, like sign up for the Maine AFL-CIO's weekly newsletter and learn about when there's strikes happening or informational pickets or other ways to just like plug into the broader labor movement. There are 100 warts in ways that we are like not where we need to be, but it's also like this is one of the only sets of institutions of actual real power with bases that cut across the political and geographic divides that I think we need to mend. And like we can't do it alone. Don't get me wrong. This is not about like the labor movement has all the solutions. We don't, but we badly need to grow. And I think like there's no fair world that I can imagine that doesn't involve a strong labor movement that also has strong allies that are in the community fighting. And so like, yeah, there's lots of thoughts there, but I think like find ways to be in solidarity with workers who are out fighting to start mending and building that trust to then say, look, climate isn't a cultural issue. Like this is a working class bread and butter issue too. But those conversations aren't going to happen if we're literally not even showing up for each other's fights.
All right, thank you so much. We technically have 10 more minutes if anyone has any questions, but we're also happy to, I think a lot's been said to sit with and think about, so I'm also happy to end the call here. All right, last chance, people of the audience. Okay, seeing none, thank you so much, Lucy and Francis. We'll make sure to add a lot of stuff to the resources that were shared in the chat. Really appreciate it, and we'll send everything out to all of your emails. Okay, John, thanks for giving us some hope. It's very
Thanks,
neat.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. That's great, Ezra. Thank you.